Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for anyone who loves hearing fascinating tales about remarkable people, intriguing topics, and significant historical events. Our hope is to inspire you to uncover and share your history and your story. Welcome to Your History, Your Story. In this episode, we're joined by author and educator Sarah Dixwell Brown to discuss her book, Regicide in the Family, Finding John Dixwell. Sarah's journey began with an ancient family heirloom that led her to uncover the dramatic life of her 7 times great-grandfather, John Dixwell, one of the judges who sentenced King Charles I of England to death in 1649. Forced to flee to the New World to escape execution himself when the monarchy was restored under King Charles II, Dixwell's story is one of intrigue, survival, and hidden history. We hope you'll enjoy this fascinating story. I'd now like to welcome Dixie Brown to our show. Welcome, Dixie.
Welcome and thank you.
I'm really happy to be speaking with you for a number of reasons. First of all, I thoroughly enjoyed your book, Regicide in the Family, Finding John Dixwell. And the other reason is that I am a big family history enthusiast. That's one of the main reasons we did this podcast, is because we want to encourage people to tell stories about themselves or interesting events. But I have a soft spot for people who are actually looking into their own family histories because, hey, a lot of people are into looking up genealogy online now. And, people are starting to say, hey, I just found out I'm related to so-and-so or what have you. But there are people who stop at that. And then there are other people who get their curiosity sparked. And you wouldn't know anything about that, would you?
Oh, no, I have no idea what you're talking about. I only spent 40 years on the book.
40 years. Yeah, that's what this is such an incredible story.
Yeah,
And I want to start off, but before we dig in, can you talk to our listeners about your academic and professional background?
absolutely. So I always wanted to be a writer. So I was incredibly lucky to get into Harvard, and I was an English major there, and I just completely love literature. So after I got my BA, I went on to teach not far from where you are, James, at a Quaker school outside of Philadelphia called George
Mhm.
School. And I just loved it. And I taught literature, but I thought, I need to be a writer. So I became a newspaper reporter for a couple of years. And I could do it, but I was best at profiles and personal stories, human interest stories, not at hard news. So I left that and went back and got my master's degree from Stanford, again in English literature. But because I'd been a high school teacher, they said, well, we'll pay for you to get the rest of your master's degree if you'll teach freshman English. And that was how I got into freshman English, teaching people how to think critically and write logical, evidence-based critical analyses. And that was so good for my own writing. And I started doing a lot of essays that I published in local and national publications. But when I should say, there was a moment, this is going back into my real life, aside from education. Should I do it?
Absolutely.
But I went to London when I was 28 while I was still getting my master's from Stanford. And they had told me that I didn't really have to write the final paper for getting my master's degree. And at first I was sort of offended. I thought, well, of course I'm going to do that. But I was in the British Museum. I got a letter of introduction. It doesn't have a reading room there anymore, but it was like the library in England at that time. And it was so fun. It was 1980. So I thought, well, I'm not going to write the paper then. I'm just going to look up old family names. And so my middle name is Dixwell. My name is Sarah Dixwell Brown. I looked up Dixwell, and by goodness, by gosh, there was a book about someone named John Dixwell who'd gotten a king beheaded. And I was just completely freaked out. I
Wow.
thought, well, surely I'm not related to that person, but it is kind of an unusual name. So that I did the research you could do back in 1980, which wasn't much, right? Because we didn't have the internet. And then I went home and I said to my father, Dad, I found this book. We're not related, are we? I mean, I was sure he would say no. He just got quiet and then he hung his head. He said, yeah, like that. And then he said direct descendants in this tone of like shame and embarrassment. And so that was the beginning.
Wow.
But
So
I didn't decide to write the book for another probably 10 years. I sort of dabbled in it. So that's why when I say 40 years, it isn't really 40 years. Plus, I was having babies and doing all those sorts of things. And then my parents were dying, and I was doing all those difficult things. But about 10 years after England, or maybe it was even more, my dad said, well, you should have this because you're the only one that's shown any interest, and it's your name anyway. Should I show it to you, James?
yeah, show it to me.
She's handed me something wrapped up in a plastic produce bag, which I've saved because it's the archival plastic produce bag from a little food mart in the town where he lived. And I said, well, what is it, Dad? We just waited while I opened it up, and then there was this key.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's the old fashioned like a skeleton. Now is that museum quality produce bag?
of course. But when I took so and it turns out this is John Dixwell's key that he brought with him when he fled England in 1660. And my father had never shown it to anybody in the family or talked about it, but I guess he knew we had it. So
He
it's
knew you had it.
like, why was he so mum about this? I think it kind of relates to the Second World War,
Hmm.
serving in the South Pacific and generally being terrified of things falling apart and tyrants
Wow.
taking over. Mussolini, you know,
Yeah.
there was a lot of Hirohito in Japan. He was in the South Pacific. So I think he really deeply disapproved of what Dixwell had done.
Okay, so I want to back up. You're working on this project for school, and then you said, all right, you know what? I'm going to sort of look around here to see what interesting thing I can find out about my own, maybe my own heritage or a name that certainly is my, it was your middle name. And then you come across this person. And when you came across some of the sources there, one of them had the word regicide in it. So I don't know a lot about the English Civil Wars, but could you just give a really brief recap as to what they were and how the word regicide plays into your family history?
Sure. And when I saw that word in the book I found in the British Museum in 1980, I didn't know that word, but I'd studied Latin a lot. And so I figured out it had to mean king killer. And really, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. So the thing that's interesting about the English Civil Wars, all of this, the ferment was going on in the 1640s. This is like 100 years or more after Martin Luther had nailed all those theses on the door, and brought in the Reformation. But that was helpful for Henry VIII just because he wanted a divorce. Up until that moment, England had been happily Catholic along with
Mm,
everybody else. And a lot of people still clung to that. And in a lot of ways, the Anglican Church really had very strong ties and roots in Catholicism, the Anglican Church, which was, the state sponsored the King's Church. So at that time, Charles was from a long line of, the monarchy, they believed in the divine right of kings, which is that you're second only to God. So any idea you have is coming straight from God. So that gives you complete license to be a tyrant and to
mm,
you're doing right. And he's not the only person in human history who has been like that.
mhm,
He also believed in the great chain of being, which is part of that, which is everything is in its place. So first God, then kings, and down at the bottom, minerals, slightly above that, earthworms. So, he was at the top of the great chain of being, so he could do anything he wanted. But meanwhile, all these ideas from the Reformation, from all kinds of other things were entering into people's minds, that literacy was pretty good. He didn't have censorship, and so all these pamphlets were being published. For some reason, Charles wasn't clamping down in that way. So all
mhm,
these pamphlets were coming out, sort of encouraging new religions to come up for people to question the king having so much power. And what Charles did in the 1640s was if he didn't like what Parliament, he started earlier than that. If he didn't like what Parliament was doing, he would just send them home. So that's why there were fights between the parliamentarians, that's members of parliament, and their men, and the king. So there were two civil wars in the 1640s. The king was on one side, so he was essentially declaring war on his own people. And tremendous loss of life, tremendous chaos, soldiers, wounded soldiers begging in the streets, people in little villages having to put up soldiers. The king wasn't paying his soldiers. People were starving. There was lots of problems with the weather and crops being lost. And it just was a giant mess. And people were sick of it.
And then, of course, you had a person called Oliver Cromwell, who was he was sort of the anti-royalist or the parliamentarian group.
Yes, very, very rigid Puritan, much more rigid than my ancestor, John Dixwell.
Mm.
One of the things that I learned when I went on my research trip to England, I finally got serious about the book after my children had grown up and my parents had died. And I went to England on a research trip. And I was lucky enough to get to meet with all these fabulous people and a professor at University College London who specializes in the English Civil War said he's pretty sure John Dixwell did not like Oliver Cromwell at all because when they first executed Charles, they wanted to make it legal. So they had a court and a lot of them were trained in the law. Like John Dixwell was a barrister, which is a pretty fancy kind of lawyer. And he had much more education than Oliver Cromwell, actually, interestingly. But so at first they had a republic for the first 3 years. And then that kind of was replaced by Oliver Cromwell's protectorate. And it just became another dictatorship, and people were just hated it. And Cromwell did just unspeakable things in Ireland. He did unspeakable things in the Caribbean, but he was a very charismatic man. He made things very difficult for people in England, and he was totally rigid. I mean, he just, he didn't want, well, actually, and yet he did good things too. He had a certain religious tolerance. It was okay to be Jewish under Cromwell. It was okay to be any of a whole number of these new things springing up, like Quakers and Baptists and Anabaptists. So he did have religious tolerance. So there were some good things about Cromwell, but he was like Charles I, sure that like if he had a battle and scores of people, thousands of people were killed and he had won, it was because God was on his side.
So we know, to back up a little bit, so your ancestor, this is just a general piece, and then we're going to talk about your journey, which is so cool, that John Dixwell was one of, I think, 59 men who signed really the death warrant for King Charles I.
Yeah, they served as judges, and there were actually 120 judges, but they
Okay.
only needed 59 to sign it. And as you can imagine, a lot of people said, I want to go out to my country estate this weekend, so I just can't sign that. Because if you signed it, you were essentially putting a bounty on your head.
It's like the Declaration of Independence. When those men signed that, they were also, that was a treasonous document.
That's right. And I'm sure they all fully understood that.
Exactly. So
That's
we
when I
know,
began to get proud of him. And you should know the Declaration of Independence and our Bill of Rights, all that stuff grew out of what John Dixwell did.
right, right. So Dixwell did that. Now, as you mentioned, that Cromwell became unpopular. He became more or less a military dictator, sort of. And then
No,
eventually,
definitely. He even had a standing army, which people didn't want.
so eventually there's the Commonwealth ends and the royalty is restored, and the son of King Charles I returns to become the king again. And of course, there's a lot of seeking revenge against the people who killed his father. So that's kind of what sets this whole thing up. So these people were fleeing who signed this document because they were in for it. As a matter of fact, this is, you mentioned in your book, and I've read this before, that Cromwell had died prior to Charles II getting back on the throne. But he was actually, they dug him up and didn't they hang him and put his head on a pike and everything after his death, Cromwell?
Well, they took off his head
Hmm.
and they put it on a pike in front of Westminster and in front of Parliament. And it was there for 25 years. And then a storm took down that pike and it went into private hands and it wasn't reunited with his body until the 20th century.
Somebody kept it as a souvenir.
I guess. It's pretty creepy looking.
Oh, I bet it is. So now let's go back to you. You came back after finding out this sort of this story, at least the general story of your ancestry. You approach your dad. Your dad's kind of like, I don't know, but you've asked, so I've got something to give you. And talk more about the key. What did that do to spark your interest into following up on the rest of the story about John Dixwell?
Well, it says on it, it had a label that was put on it by my great great grandfather, Epps Sergeant Dixwell. And it says, John Dixwell in command. And then it says Dover Castle. And he says ESD, which were his initials, Epps Sergeant Dixwell. So I thought, well, why was he in command of Dover Castle? And I didn't even know what Dover Castle is. It's a military fortification. It's not some fancy king's, nobleman's manor house. It's a military fortification.
From what I've read about Dover Castle, you spoke about it in the book, is that it was kind of the key to England because isn't that where the Romans landed and
Always where invaders could get in.
mm,
It had a huge role even during the Second World War. There's still a brigadier that can have an apartment there, the head of the British military. So it's a fascinating place. I got a massive tour of it because I went on a book tour in May,
mhm.
and I got invited to speak 6 different places in England, which was really fun. And
Wow.
they gave me this fabulous tour, and there's all these tunnels because it sits on white chalk, which is
Hmm.
a substratum that's terrific for making tunnels. So there are tunnels from the Napoleonic Wars. There's 4.5 miles of tunnels, and I think 5 layers of tunnels up. So I got to see the Second World War tunnels, which were so moving because my father was a surgeon in the South Pacific, and there were all the bandages that were up in our attic left over from the war. There they were
Oh,
at Dover. But yeah, so that meant he was doing something pretty important. But what? I didn't know. I needed to find out
you need
more.
to find out. So you had this key. So he when he fled England, I want to leave a lot of this story for the reader to find out themselves when they get your
Okay.
book. But he went on this journey of escape, really.
He lied. I mean, Charles II, at first he said, well, I'm going to forgive people, And then he said, except not going to sign, not the people that signed the death warrant. And some of them just so believed in what they did that they turned themselves in and they were hung, drawn, and quartered at Charing Cross. It was really quite something. So they summoned John Dixwell and he said, absolutely, I'll be there, but I'm sick. He had a relative write this little note. I'm sick. Oh, John Dixwell is sick, but he will be there. Just give him a chance to recover. But no, he was, who knows how, getting himself over to Germany.
You know, Dixie, John Dixwell was a survivor.
Yeah.
My goodness me, when you think of how many of his colleagues, if you want to put it that way, were hunted down and killed, even out of the country, they were found and hunted down, which you found out. But so let's follow your journey now. You mentioned this starts in like 1980, and your book I see was published. It says 2022 in it. So
Yes.
that's a long journey. Now you weren't writing the book the whole time. You were doing other things. You were raising a family and teaching and all those things. But you really start to get interested in really nailing this down. You actually just have to decide to get on a plane. And
Yes.
yeah, so at that point, I think you mentioned maybe your parents had passed at that point.
Yes. Long since.
Yeah, so you chose a very good friend to go with you who sounded terrific, a great traveling
A
companion.
student, one of my students, a woman from Korea.
Wonderful. So you did this. So now, where do you start with something like this? What was in your brain as to how this was going to roll out?
Well, my writing group, I've been in the same writing group for years, and we help each other with all of our stuff. That we critique each other's manuscripts. And they said, you have to take the key back to the castle. I said, no way. They said, no, you have to. So then Mi-Chung, my student, I said, my writing, she's always asking, how's your book going? I said, oh, I don't know. My writing group was, and then she said she'd go to England with me. And I was just terrified because now I had no excuse not to go. So I wanted her to change her mind. She didn't. And so off we went. And she was the best of traveling companions. So I started just emailing people whose names I'd seen in my research. And they all got back to me and said I could meet with them. It was incredible. We were just there for 2 weeks, but I just got every interview in with librarians, with professors. It was incredible. So, and they were just so nice. I don't know what I thought that they'd say, well, you're a terrible person. We're going to throw you in jail and we're going to confiscate the key. I mean, I actually had thoughts like that. I was nervous because there are, to this day, people just hate the regicides throughout the British Empire. I was so kind of ambivalent about what John Dixwell had done, not the least because I spent a lot of time at Quaker schools and I'd gone to Quaker meeting at one point in my life years ago. And it's horrible what they did to Charles I, right? To behead somebody. But in England that I started, people would say, you should be proud of him. And it's really very important what he did. I mean, maybe the end hopefully justifies the means, but they were able to think about it in a nuanced way that I very much needed. And they also were able to come up with amazing things. Like a lot of my purpose in going to England was to try to understand why he had chosen to do what he did, what his parentage was like, what the Dixwell family leading up to John Dixwell was like, and to some extent, what the Dixwell family was like after he made that decision to serve as judge and sign the death warrant. So I was able to get tons of stuff about that and then just continue the work once I got home.
Yeah, because you find out that somebody, signed a death warrant for a king, and you want to kind of get inside that person's head a little bit. You're talking about from the 17th century. So it's a person and a family from a different country 400 years ago, and you're trying to get inside that person's head. Now, many of us don't even know anything about our great grandparents, let
Right.
alone 7 times great
Right.
grandfathers. So you wanted to find out who this person was. And so you didn't meet a lot of resistance, but what I found fun about your story was just the little pieces like worrying about whether you were going to eat because
No,
of where
it
you
was
were
a real
staying.
problem because I got so much work done, there was no time to eat. And I'm little and I got really hungry and I'm old. Yeah.
But
But
you
it's so
traced,
cool because I was able to find out about his parents and his grandparents and see actual documentation of like where his father had studied. And so his father had a lot of education, but died when John Dixon wasn't even 3. So there was the first sort of trauma that could have contributed to your being willing to throw yourself under the bus the way he did by signing that thing. And then his brother, they had to break up the family because his father died. And that's what they did in those days. So there were 6 little ones. So no family could take on 6, but they split them up. So 2 of them went to live with their rich bachelor uncle, and that was John and his older brother Mark. So even though Mark wasn't the firstborn, he became the firstborn once they lived with Uncle Basil. And so that meant John was a second son, like a spare heir, like Harry. So he was never going to inherit any money. It's no wonder he had to go and study the law. But then Mark was killed in the First Civil War, fighting on the side of the parliamentarians. So there's another thing, first getting orphaned and then his brother dying in the Civil War. Did those contribute to radicalizing him? And then where he's read the law, there wasn't law school back in those days, but you went to one of the 4 Inns of Court in London and you read the law and you did moot court, with hypothetical cases. And eventually you got good enough to argue it in court. And if you were good enough, you passed the bar. And he did.
and that's the way it works. He did have legal training. His brother, who he was probably pretty close with him because he was the one who went with him to live at his uncle's house. So there were reasons why he was in that position and maybe why he made the decision to sign the death warrant. But you were able to actually sit in places where John Dixwell lived, where John Dixwell's father studied.
And Lincoln's Inn, which was the most radical of the Inns of Court, I was able to interview a librarian at the place where John Dixwell had studied law in the library where he probably read law books.
Hmm.
And I got to see his brother Mark's signature in the register book when John Dixwell was admitted to Lincoln's Inn, because Mark also was admitted to Lincoln's Inn. But if you were the firstborn, you just went for like a year to put a little shine on you, like going to finishing school if you were a rich young lady. So Mark Dixwell went probably for a year to Lincoln's Inn, but John Dixwell was there for 7 years.
Hmm.
It really, really got incredibly well educated and good at arguing.
So here's the thing. Again, the way things worked out
Yeah,
for your seven times great grandfather was that he was, where he was in the birth order. He originally they didn't have much money because his father was a pastor, right? He was a,
exactly.
a clergyman, didn't
That's
have much money. Then there's a rich relative. His brother is going to be the one to inherit it, but John gets a good education, being, the younger of the two, but then his brother is killed in the Civil War. So now John not only has the education, but now he has the estate that he's in charge of, and he's going to take care of his brother's family. So he's got the sort of the power.
But no, but even though he gets the estate, because Mark, before he got killed, already had had a son, all John could do was manage it until the son came of age. So
Mm,
once again, he wasn't going to get anything.
no, but he had some influence at that time, or we thought he
Yeah,
would.
no, I
So
mean, he was managing an enormous estate, probably had 2,500 acres or
which you
more.
visited, right? You visited that
Oh,
estate.
indeed. I stayed in the house where he lived.
That was so terrific. Now, just so Dixwell flees, he gets out of the country, he brings the key to Dover Castle with him. He flees, I believe, to Germany,
Right.
and then eventually he ends up in the New World. And tell us about when Dixwell arrived. I mean, the British Empire was far-reaching, so King Charles had agents seeking out people, not just in England, but in Germany and Holland and the New World. Tell us about when your ancestor reached the New World and what that was like initially for him.
Well, the thing is, Whaley and Gough left immediately in 1660, like sort of as Charles II's boat was bringing him from France to England. Their boat was taking them across the Atlantic to the New World. And we know quite a lot about them. They went first to Boston, and so when John Dixwell arrived, it was 1665. So Whaley and Gough had already been in the New World for 5 years, and Dixwell went first to their place where they were being hidden in Hadley, Massachusetts.
Which is near where you live now, right?
Where I live, and I didn't notice actually until I think after the book was published, did I notice this? That in Hadley, there's a Whaley Street and a Gough Street, little short streets just past Dunkin' Donuts. So Hadley's like enormously proud. I wish they had a Dixwell Street, but he was only there. We don't really know how long Dixwell was there. We don't know how he got from Germany to Hadley. Like we don't know where he came in. Did he come in New Amsterdam, in New York, or did he come in Boston? We don't know.
Hmm.
We do know because William Gough was a journal writer. He wrote an entry about how Dixwell had arrived that day. So that was able to be witnessed by people before the journal was thrown in the mud just before the American Revolution, because everybody was so mad at Thomas Hutchinson, the then governor, that they raided his beautiful library and threw it all out into the rain and the mud. And
Oh.
Gough's journal was lost. Heartbreaking.
Oh gosh, I bet now. So, but Dixwell ends up in New Haven,
Yeah,
Connecticut.
so eventually he went down New Haven, and unlike Whaley and Gough, he did this whole elaborate thing of changing his identity. I mean, they did to some extent, but they were older. Their families were back in England. They were sort of just aging sadly in the New World, whereas John Dixwell, he might have been their age, but he'd never married or had kids, and he got to do that in New Haven by changing his identity.
And here's the thing. So, John Dixwell was taking care of his brother's family for many years.
Yes,
He's well
18.
educated,
Yeah.
right? He's well known. He was obviously a very man of a lot of prestige and trust to hold the key to Dover Castle.
But that was
But
just for a few months. Most of the time he was in the House of Commons. He was in charge of sewers, doing all these committees, just like in Washington. He was on all these different committees, serving in various governmental roles in Kent, especially during Cromwell's era, because he didn't like Cromwell. And then
Right.
when Will died, suddenly Dixwell's back in the House of Commons. He's into being in London again. So,
Ah,
and then
but
he was only appointed to be governor the last like 8 months of the interregnum.
he was appointed to be governor
Yeah, of the Dover Castle.
of Dover Castle.
That was just a very brief period before Charles sailed back from France.
Mm, okay. So, but John never, up until he was probably in his 60s, or so, at least until he was at New Haven, he never married. So
Right.
he had a niece that he stayed in touch with in England. She was pretty much the only one who hadn't written him off, but he didn't have any of his own heirs, any of his own children. But that changed, didn't it?
It's so fascinating.
Tell
It's
us about it.
moving to me like, what would that be like to have your first baby at the age of 66?
Ike's. I couldn't imagine it.
And he married twice in New Haven.
Tell us about the first wife,
But
though.
but we're giving the whole book away.
Yeah, but I don't want to give the whole book away. Let's just fast forward to the fact he does have children.
Okay.
He's still in touch with the people back in England. But
Yes.
I think I want people to find out more about her, but there's a young lady named Bathsheba, who is your seven times great grandmother. Can you tell us about her and how she became sort of a fascination to you in your research? Because you really dug deep to learn about her.
Well, I just was determined because, I am a woman, and it's amazing how little information there is about women,
Hmm.
about history. I mean, you can find a lot out about the men, but the women, it's almost as if they didn't exist. And part of that is when you got married under English common law, which was what they had in the colonies, was
Hmm.
the minute you married, you ceased to exist as a legal entity. It was called coverture. You were covered by your husbands. You couldn't own property. If you earned money, it was your husband's. Your children weren't your own, they were your husband's. So, it's no wonder that there's no information, there's no records. But at the New Haven Museum, they found some little notes about not only Bathsheba, but her older sister, who had been kind of little rebels in very rigid New Haven. And it's in the New Haven books.
What a prize that was when you
I
recount some
was
of
so
the.
thrilled to get that.
I love it.
Yeah, I mean, like they got in trouble. I mean, her older sister got in trouble, and she sort of got in trouble. One of the Howe sisters, her last name was Howe, said the Bible wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Oops.
Ouch. Ooh. Yeah. Yeah. That. So now, so this woman is way younger than your John Dixwell.
35 years, 35 years,
25.
35.
Okay. And they do have three children,
Yes.
and you are descended from obviously one of those children. Who was that?
John Dixwell,
Hmm.
who became a silversmith because there wasn't enough money for him to go to Harvard. So he went into
Hmm.
trades. And that created problems. This is all in my afterward with a relative over in England who was childless. So he was kind of looking for an heir, and he thought, well, maybe he would grab an American heir. But he couldn't stand it that there wasn't enough money for the heir that he wanted to have be his heir because there wasn't enough money. And so he went into the trades also like his father. So John Dixwell, the silversmith, went over to England and was all buddy buddy with, what was he? He was a baronet with Baronet Basil Dixwell. Buddy buddy. There's all these passionate letters between them that I got to read at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Amazing.
That is amazing. Now,
But
for
then John Dixwell died of the smallpox inoculation. So then his son, Basil Dixwell, because Sir Basil Dixwell had wanted John Dixwell, the silversmith, to name a kid Basil. So he did. He went home and had a kid named Basil. But Basil Dixwell had to go into the trades because his dad died when he was little. And so Sir Basil in England just got furious and said, how could you think I would even consider? If you come over here, I'll turn you out of doors. I don't want to see you.
mm,
You're uneducated dirt.
wow, so you got this
Essentially.
class thing going on. Yeah.
Yes. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Oh,
Wow.
yes. Oh, yes. So, but then he softened and sent Basil and his sibs 50 pounds apiece in his will.
Oh, but Dixie, I noticed in as far as when you were researching, again, you're trying to get in the mind of John Dixwell, but you've also got the people around him that you're finding out all sorts of things,
Right.
which is a great find for you. And I know historians like I remember David McCullough. I used to listen to about how he would write history, and when he was writing a book, he used to go to the places where things happened that he was writing about just to feel that sense. So you did a lot of that. You sat in all those places. But here you are, he ends up pretty much right in your backyard from England, where you first found out about him. And you start to focus a lot on like where his mind was at when he was near the end of his life, because he had escaped really a lot of peril. I mean, he could have easily been captured at any time, but he was very concerned about finances at
Yeah.
the end. And I know there's a side story about his first wife and how he came into some money there, but he was always hoping, I think, that he would get some assistance, his family get some assistance from
He felt
England.
it was stuff that he owned that he felt that they owed him
Hmm.
because he had owned some stuff that was
Hmm.
his that he left in England, and he just assumed they'd give it back to him. No way, because they basically removed him from the family tree. You can't get too mad at them because they could have been killed for
Sure.
regicide. That's why Sir Basil was potentially kind of nice to his descendants because he needed an heir. But for the first generation, no way would they have anything to do with John Dixwell. It was way too dangerous, which is why it's so sad. We have all the letters he received in exile in the New Haven Museum, but we don't have any of the letters he wrote from New Haven because I'm sure they had to destroy them. Because if they'd been caught corresponding with him, they would have been killed in England.
Hmm. I always think, Dixie, how brave his one niece was to maintain a correspondence with
I
him.
know, I love Eliza. I have a chapter called Eliza the Brave. But yeah, so they didn't get any of that money. And so they were sort of relying on, and you're right, I did have to look into neighbors in New Haven, like who would have helped them, you know? Especially as a woman, who couldn't earn any money. And Bathsheba was not for money and education at all. I think she probably did go to a dame school and get so she could read and write, but that's about all.
Hmm.
But only two of the three babies she had survived. So I did find out she went and lived with her daughter, Mary, who married a minister, of course. So she was taken care of in that way. But it doesn't look as though the son, John Dixwell, who trained as a silversmith in Boston, helped his mother very much. I don't think he did, but it wasn't the custom, I suppose.
No. Now, so when John passes away, where is he actually buried?
In New Haven, behind Center Church, at first under a little stone that wouldn't reveal his identity. And that
Hmm.
stone drove me crazy because it said he died in the 82nd year of his age. But in fact, he was lying. He was only 76 when he died. And I found that out in England. I wanted to confirm that in England. So I was able to find his actual birth record.
Yeah. People today often may be tempted to lie about their age and make themselves younger, but from what you said in your research is that perhaps in those days it was like a crown of glory to be older.
That's right. You were wise and you might have more money, I suppose. I mean, I did wonder what Bathsheba's parents were thinking of marrying their daughter off to this really very old person who was saying he was way older than he was. He lied by 6 years. I mean, he has to have known how old he was. That I never did really crack that code.
Yeah. Now, Bathsheba's not buried next to him, is she?
No, she's buried up near her daughter.
Okay. Okay. Have you been to see her grave yet?
Of course.
She did. Okay, you did. Okay.
Interestingly, of all the weathered gravestones in this antique burial ground, hers is the least weathered, and every word is still legible. And it says relict of John Dixwell. It does not have the word regicide on it. And so that's the other thing that's interesting. Like, did they claim him for his political activities? Not for the first 100 years, not till after the Revolutionary War did the descendants in America admit their connection to somebody who'd done something like that. They did take back the name, but they did not talk about the regicide. After the Revolutionary War, they're boasting about it. And so that's why that little tiny grave became a big fancy grave in the middle of the 19th century. some of his descendants went in and made a really big fancy grave telling the whole story as an obelisk on the New Haven Green behind Center Church if you want to go look at it.
If I am up that way, I will definitely go because now I know so much about this man from your research. But I'm so happy as somebody who loves promoting family history that we found somebody who, over a span of, I mean, the idea of who this person was in your head for 40 years. And and a lot of that time, we didn't have the digital archives, the internet accessibility, and stuff like that. So you had to do what I call boots on the ground stuff, like going to England, actually getting on a plane. When you actually got on that plane, you were like, I can't believe I'm doing this. I can't believe I'm actually
I
doing this.
know,
There's no turning back now. And you brought
right?
somebody with you who's going to hold you accountable.
Right. You're gonna feed me. She fed me.
Yeah, she had an
It was so
endless
cute. She brought a
trove.
suitcase full of Korean food. It was amazing. I had no idea till we got there. It was so wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you could, I asked this to a lot of our guests, if you could sit down with John Dixwell now and have a cup of tea with him, is there something that's still lacking in your research that you would like to ask him?
How many questions do I get to have, James?
Oh, I can give you a couple. I know you'd have 500,
I
but
have
could you think of a
500.
couple?
I do want to know why he changed his age on all the documents. Like, what? Why did you do that? I know that he felt good about what he did right to the end of his life. I'd like to ask him what he felt about women because he let his little girl learn how to read. I love that. So I think he really valued women in a way that was unusual for that era. And I want to ask him what he felt about it. And the person that he really loved and who cared about him in England was not a man, it was his niece.
I
So,
like that. I like that. Dixie, there was something very touching in your research about his daughter. It was his daughter Mary,
right.
and he said that he wanted to leave the books that he's designated to Mary for her enjoyment.
Yes, not her instruction,
Yeah,
her enjoyment.
that was big. That said something. Yeah. In the end, would you like him? Do you think
Oh,
if
I
he were?
would. I didn't know that for years, but I would. I think he was wonderful. I think he was a very subtle thinker and he was really well educated and really thought deeply about things. And I wish so much I could talk to him. Nobody's ever asked me that before, James. That's a terrific question.
No, thank you. There's no likenesses of him, are there?
No. And everybody sees the book and they think it's John Dixwell. And I say,
No.
no, that's Charles the First. Because we have no image of John Dixwell. We do have images of his uncle. Yeah, Uncle Sir Basil.
Yes.
Sir
Yep.
Basil was so wealthy he wanted to be painted by the same guy who painted Charles the First, Anthony van Dyck, who was the Dutch portraitist of that era.
That is so cool. And you described, I guess you had a moment where you were able to look and focus in on the painting of Basil and kind of
Yeah,
get into his
and I
head.
knew the dirt about Basil, so I looked at him. I said, "You know, you murdered somebody, and you acted like it didn't even matter, and you got pardoned. How do you feel about that, Basil?"
Yeah, yeah, Basil. But it's a very amazing painting. You can look into his face and you think he must have had a lot of money. But the story about that you uncovered about him is very good. When people get into the book and get that story, that's also interesting. So certainly you've got a very, very famous person in your family. Um,
Well, nobody. What he was a little fish in all of that. I'm the first person that's really brought out his story. Some of the people involved in the English Civil Wars and the Regicide are very famous, but John Dixwell is not. So that was
yeah,
for me was to bring his story to light and say, what can I find out about him? It was just scraps, as you can tell from reading my book. I had to put together scraps.
you did. You had to do that, but what he was part of was critical in world history, really, at
Yeah.
that time, and ultimately affected perhaps a little bit of our founding of our nation, and things along those lines could be associated in some ways with that as well. But if you got somebody else who they don't know a lot about their family and they want to do some research and find out stories about people. What kind of words of encouragement or guidance would you give to someone who's interested in just sort of opening up their family history?
First of all, I'd say do it. It's just worth everything. And also, I'd say everybody's family going back is so important. It doesn't have to be somebody on the world stage. I mean, if your person was in the pogroms in Russia, find out about the shtetl if you can, where they lived. Find out about what it was like when they came through Ellis Island. And there's so many, once you get going, like join a genealogy society. So, but I didn't do that. I was so self-taught. But I mean, then you find, and also I found it from history professors, like go and find their will, go and find estate inventories, find out what they owned and where they lived and who their neighbors were. And you will be amazed at how much you can build a story.
Oh, I love that, Dixie. And the other thing is, I know from my own experiences, asking older relatives, because some of them, as like you said with your dad, he didn't really want to talk about it. It wasn't until you found out something, you might find that somebody either isn't really interested in it, or maybe there's something they think is a little bit shameful for the family. So I guess being bold enough to ask is important as well.
Yeah, I think being a newspaper reporter helped me with that. I'm always willing to ask. It kills me that I didn't ask Dad what his attitude was towards John Dixwell. I really didn't ask him. I think maybe I was
Hmm.
so amazed by the way he hung his head. He was a very quiet person, and I think I was sort of not wanting to be a fool rushing in where angels fear to tread with him, but I should have. And I did
Yep.
find out from cousins that their fathers, who were had Dixwell as a middle name or whatever, lots of people have Dixwell as a middle name in this country, had boasted about what John Dixwell did, and they talked about it over the dinner table. So my family was different, and yet we were the ones that, by whatever weird thing, had the key.
Hmm.
Another family has the sword. I found that out, has John Dixwell's sword. It's up in Maine. That's not in my book, but a second cousin has a sword.
I like that. Now you had mentioned that you initially started thinking about the story, the book being about your dad, you, and John Dixwell, and that in the end, you John Dixwell's story became so fascinating and intriguing that it really became about him.
One thing that was so neat when I was at Stanford, I took a creative writing, short story writing class, and our teacher would say, looking at these messy attempts that we'd written, he'd say, "Whose story is this?"
Hmm.
Which is why I did, because I had so much trouble figuring out whose story it was, because I cared about my own story and my dad's story. But it really was John Dixwell's story. You're right. I'm so glad you teased that out from reading it.
Yeah, I know he played a small part in the beginning of the book, but I really liked your dad. There was something very intriguing about him.
Oh, I know. I miss him.
Yeah, good guy. But Dixie, this has been fun.
Good.
Somebody's head being chopped off is not necessarily a fun topic, but
No.
man, it's a big story, and it really it's a tribute to you and your research and your stick-to-itiveness, your perseverance, and your ability to get tea cakes and squirrel them away so you won't be starving later.
Right.
You know, this is fun. How can people find out more about your book, Regicide in the Family, Finding John Dixwell, and other things that you're doing?
Oh, thank you so much. So my first choice is for you to get the book itself from Levelers Press, which is my publisher, because frankly, bookstores and Amazon, where you can also get it, take a big cut. So get it from Levelers, and you just can do that by going to my website, sarahdixwellbrown.com. But in my excitement about actually being a published writer, I made an audiobook and I narrated it. So that's
Ooh.
available through audible.com. And then finally, about a year ago, we got it together and it's a ebook too. So if you want to read it on your Kindle, you can. But I love paper. I love paper and ink. So now I'm researching. Um, when my parents had not died yet, but we had to get them into a nursing home where they get
Mhm.
more care. It took forever to go through all their stuff because they were both pack rats back many generations. And we got through all the furniture and stuff like that, got down to 30 boxes of paper, letters, records. And my sister said, let's throw it in the dumpster. And I said, no. They said, well, you take it. I said, no, I have a ranch house. I have this small. I'm divorced. I'm a single mom. No. And they said, well, we'll throw them out. So I took them. So they've been in my basement giving off bad juju for 20 years. And when the book came out, I finally had time to go through the boxes, and I found the most extraordinary things from the 19th century. So now I'm writing about my mother's side of the family, who were in Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. And it's much harder because there's nothing about women, but I want to just do women. And so I have their voices in their letters.
I love it. That is great. Let me know when you
Well, I
put
don't
that
know
into a
if
book.
there's enough time left in my life to get another book done, but I do have it. It will probably be an article, will be in American Ancestors magazine, which is the New England Historic and Genealogical Society has expressed interest in this first article about my three greats grandmother. So
Oh,
it will be a magazine story, and maybe it'll be the first chapter of a book. I don't know yet.
oh, that is terrific. And I know I have a hard copy of your book about John Dixwell, and I like to imagine that it would have in the inside of the cover that it is for our reading enjoyment.
Good. You mean you enjoyed it?
Yeah, it was
That,
good because
that's what I want to hear.
I enjoyed it, and I'll tell you what I really liked about it. First of all, your side journey. I mean, you're like me. I do think about, I get running on something, and then you realize, hey, wait a minute, my stomach hurts. I'm hungry, and you got to plan out your.
No, you lose all track of time.
You lose all track of time, but it's so fascinating. But you have to get up and go and do it. And my wife is Kelly's always on me because I research a bunch of stuff and then I don't write it down. I just put it in my head. And you took notes and you were able to refer to notes that you took years earlier. So I commend you. It was a good instructional book for me. I'm from an English background, and so the history of the Civil Wars was very educational for me. And it's kind of neat that it ends up in the colonies here, not far from my house. I mean, I live in New Jersey, so not far, and it becomes American history as well. So it's cool. Thank you, Dixie, for spending time with us. I wish you all the best in your future writings, and I'm very excited about it. I hope we can stay in touch, and you can let me know when that article comes out.
Thank you. I enjoyed it immensely. You really asked good questions.
Thank you, and have a great day, okay?
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your History, Your Story. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, X, and Instagram to stay connected. We'd love to hear from you whether you have questions, comments, or a story to share. Until next time, be well and God bless.